Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. A few administrative things before we go into the substance today. So we've now graded all of the midterms and sort of looked at overall how things went. And so I think people did well. There were some parts that were harder than others. So what do you think the median was? The median on the first midterm was 80. Uh-oh, not good. Is that hopefully not open? The median on the first midterm was 80. What do you think the median on this midterm was? 70, exactly 70, yeah. So it was 10 points harder than the first one, and that was accounted for almost entirely by problem 1 and problem 5 were tough. I had ratcheted up the difficulty on those. So problem 1 was the one with the different marginal costs of two different firms, marginal cost of pollution reduction, and problem 5 was the one with the continuous version of the marginal cost. So in any case, I think the average on those two questions was like 10 or 11. So basically that accounts for the whole move from 80 down to 70. But what that means is that if your grade didn't fall, or if it fell by less than 10 points, then you did better on this one than on the first one. So there will be lots of happy news with this. But any questions on it? Yeah. Oh, wait, let me throw it to you.
What was the mean?
The median was 70 and the mean was 68. Yeah. Other questions about it? About the midterm? So we'll be handing those back in section. Let's see, anything else? Also, you have an assigned reading that we'll be talking about in class today. And we didn't specify which pages of it. So I'll be talking about this today, this Billion Prices project. So it's a 28-page document, and I realized last night that we hadn't uploaded it yet. It's a reading for this week that I'll be talking about, but you're only responsible for the first 18 pages. So let me see, do we stop? Well, basically, I only want you to read the first 18 pages. You're welcome to read the last 10, but lessons for macro and international research, you can stop there, okay? And this is an example of how big data, how technology is transforming the way that we measure inflation. Okay. And then finally, today I have a seminar that I have to attend during the usual office hours, so I'm not going to do office hours today. But if you want to meet with me, if you were hoping to go to office hours at that time and want to meet with me, just shoot me an email and we can set up a time to meet, okay? Okay, any questions from last time before I get started? No? Okay, great. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a few topics. We're going to talk about unemployment, finish up talking about unemployment. We're going to talk about inflation, which is something macroeconomists care a lot about. And then finally, we're going to talk about international trade and the current account deficit in the US. And the last topic is especially relevant right now, given what is happening in the global economy. I don't know how much, so the US, the world is increasingly interconnected through trade, and as we see right now, the coronavirus is having a big effect health-wise in China and in some other places too, but also globally, it's having a big economic impact. I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, great. So why don't we start? We'll start out talking about unemployment. So this is about as good a time as there has been in the US in terms of unemployment, with the rate at about 3.6%. But as I showed you in figures last time, the unemployment rate varies lots over time. And so what are the factors that drive changes in unemployment in the short run? So one of them is what economists refer to as cyclical unemployment. So this is unemployment that arises when the economy starts to let's say, go into a recession. Firms may become less optimistic about the demand for their products, and this can lead to a shift in the demand for labor. And some industries can be differentially affected by this. So two industries that were especially hard hit in the 2008, 2009 recession were the auto industry and construction. So right before the Great Recession is what economists refer to it. Not great because it's wonderful, but great because it was so significant an impact on output. The number of cars manufactured in the US went from about 17 million annually to 10 million in the course of 2 years. And so that led to a lot of people losing their jobs as a result, because places like GM, Ford, Chrysler, Toyota, and so forth didn't need to hire as many people if they were making 40% fewer vehicles. Construction was also an industry that got really hard hit. So some industries are more cyclical than others. If you look at like the healthcare sector, employment in the healthcare sector just tends to go up over time. It went up even during the Great Recession. And so I'm going to draw this out, the sort of model of this on the next slide. And so you can think of two different examples, one of an increase versus a reduction in labor demand. So the example that I just gave of the Great Recession was an example of a reduction in labor demand, but we could also have an increase in labor demand. And so I want to do two different examples here. Here's L and W. Here's L and W again. And start with labor supply and labor demand. And I want to stress with this figure that there may be an asymmetry in how the economy responds to an increase in labor demand and a reduction in labor demand. An increase in labor demand graphically might look like this as companies become more optimistic. Okay, if the amount of labor previously had been at L0, it might rise up to L1, with the wage correspondingly increasing as well. Okay, and this would be an example of a sort of shift that was happening that would lead to more employment in the economy and higher wages as well. Now suppose that instead what happened was a reduction in labor demand. So that instead of going to the right, labor demand went to the left. So initially we were at a wage of W0 and L0. Initially we were at total quantity of labor L sub 0 and a wage of W sub 0. Now what previous research has tended to find is that when the economy starts to turn down, when labor demand starts to fall, instead of going to a point like this, instead what often happens is a bigger reduction in employment to a place like this, because wages are sticky down, okay? In general, companies prefer not to lower wages for all of their workers across the board, but instead to potentially hire fewer people or lay off workers. So basically adjust to the reduction in demand by reducing L1. So there's an asymmetry here in the response of the economy to these two shifts in labor demand. And basically this asymmetric relationship, previous research suggests wages are sticky down and instead employment adjusts. And part of the reason that economists think that firms do this, one is that the firm can then decide who leaves. So suppose the company has two choices. They can lower wages by 5% for everyone and reduce employment by 5%. Or they can lower employment by 10% and keep wages the same. They tend to opt for the latter more than the former, because they can pick who leaves. If you lower the wages for everyone, a risk is that there will be adverse selection in the sense that the people who will decide to stay after you the people who will decide to leave voluntarily when you lower the wage are your very best workers. So it's a way to avoid that kind of adverse selection. Similarly, like another reason that workers may pay higher than W1 in that example is companies may want to pay efficiency wages, wages higher than they need to at that equilibrium to earn worker loyalty. There may also be implicit contracts within the company. There may be a sense that if you're paying me $20 an hour this year, implicitly there's an agreement that you won't lower that in the future. And also that insiders in the company are able to prevent wage reductions from happening. So all of this is just to say that there may be big differences between an increase versus a reduction in labor demand. Okay, I'm going to pause there for a sec, see if you guys have questions on this. Okay, it looks good. Okay. Another possible, one possible driver of an increase in the demand for labor is a rise in productivity. And so suppose that productivity at a company has been rising steadily over time, and that basically as a result, wages have been going up correspondingly from W0 to W1, from W1 to W2, and so forth. Okay, it may take time. So suppose now that productivity stops rising, but the company is used to giving workers a 3% raise each year. 3% is like a sort of standard raise that people will get if they stay with a company from one year to the next. So suppose they get a 3% raise from year 0 to year 1, from year 1 to year 2, and they get it again from year 2 to year 3, even though productivity doesn't go up. Okay, in that kind of an example, what can happen is you can see that wages keep going up, but the demand for workers at this firm, if they keep giving these raises, is going to fall. And so you're going to have now unemployment, a disconnect between the number of workers willing to work, let's say at W4, and the number of workers that a firm is willing to hire at W4. Okay, and that's how we can get unemployment once productivity has been rising and then stops rising. And OpenStax does a nice example. They walk through an example in the US when productivity had been rising steadily for many years, and then they give some data on the specific years, and then it stopped rising and unemployment started to rise as a result. A similar, the opposite sort of thing can happen if productivity has been stagnant for a long time, and we've just been kind of stuck at a quantity of labor Q sub 0, and let's call it W sub 0 here. But then suppose that productivity unexpectedly surges, you can actually see in this case, unemployment, you've got basically unemployment will fall lots because the demand for the number of workers, so productivity has risen and the company's got used to not giving wages for a while, wage rises for a while, but their demand for workers at this new, given their productivity increase may go up, and so now we may have very low unemployment, below sort of the typical level of unemployment in the economy. Okay, and related to this is you're reading one of the readings on your on the syllabus, one explanation for weak wage growth, workers' reluctance to switch jobs. So we're going to be talking about this issue more over the next couple of weeks, but it's really a surprise to many economists that we have unemployment of 3.6% in the US, and yet wages have not been rising. And so one of the explanations that economists have come up with, instead of focusing on the number of people without jobs, watch the rate at which workers are switching between jobs. That's interesting. That is, so basically, while unemployment fell quickly after the financial crisis, job switching rates have recovered more slowly and remain lower than in earlier decades. So it used to be the case that people in the US economy were much more mobile. They moved from one job to another. And now actually people are sticking around with the same company for longer. And that is surprising because changing jobs is often lucrative. US workers who switch jobs gain 4% more pay on average than those who stay put. And why the slowdown in job switching in the US? One important driver is workers' increased caution in the wake of the financial crisis. And basically switching jobs is good on average, but it's risky, and so workers may be reluctant to do that. And an aging population also plays a large role. So this puzzle of how unemployment can be at 3.6%, and yet wages are not increasing very much, this may be part of the explanation. So if you look, and the ages at which people are most likely to change jobs, the age is in their 20s. So people in their 20s move around jobs a lot, whereas people in their 50s and 60s don't move around jobs very much. And so as we've seen the aging of the baby boom population, so the baby boom population is defined as people born 1946 to 64. And as they have aged, and now some of them are into retirement age, but as they have aged and accounted for a larger share of the workforce, a bigger share of the workforce is at low transition rate ages. So this aging population is an important factor too. So there's more that they talk about in this article, but these are the key things that I want you to take away from it. There's actually, and if you look at, so there's really good data that can follow people over time in their career. And if you look at workers, let's say in their 20s and 30s, often the way that people achieve wage gains is not through staying at the same company, but moving from one company to another. So the fact that people are moving less rapidly today partly explains why wages seem to be going up less rapidly than usual. We got a question over here. Do you mind throwing, oh, whoops. You mind throwing that? Oh, you already got it.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So, is it possible that like the growth of the business that is employing individuals, like might be offset by like lower wages amid stagnant demand, as opposed to like having increased demand for labor, but therefore being forced to pay more competitive prices for said labor? Like, how's the growth of the business?
So can you start again?
Yeah. So, like, how is the growth of business of a particular business affected when they may have stagnant demand but are able to pay lower wages to their workers, as opposed to like an environment that has increasing demand, but therefore requires more competitive wages?
So in general, I think wages are going to be higher in that latter example
Right.
than in the first one.
But like is there like an optimal medium at which like it's better for them to like have demand below a certain point in terms of like fueling expansion?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
So, maybe we can catch up at the break, and
right.
maybe I haven't consumed enough coffee yet this morning.
All right, for sure.
There's an example of a famous economist who, and this describes a little bit how economists think about the labor market, which I think is kind of amusing. So, story of this famous economist who was recruited away from one university to another. Stanford wasn't one of the two universities. High-level person. This is a person who might in the future win the Nobel Prize, done all this important research, and arrived at his new institution. And when he arrived, he's bringing boxes up to his office, and the dean sees him arrive at his new office and comes in and says, "Oh, I'm so happy to see that you're here. I'm so happy that we succeeded in recruiting you. Welcome." I'm not going to name this person. And the economist said to the dean, "Oh, I'm very sorry to hear that. You should be indifferent." His point being that he should have negotiated up to a point, extracting as much possible surplus so that the employer, his future employer, would be indifferent. So in any case, it's not the way most people, I guess, I doubt most of you would want, after you leave Stanford, for your first job to have your employer indifferent about whether you came or not. But some economists do think about it that way. But we'll catch up at the break, because I think maybe you can show me on paper, okay? Great. Okay, any other questions? Sorry, I couldn't nail that one. Okay, great. So that was a description of changes in the cyclical rate of unemployment that move, let's say, as the economy is fluctuating, let's say as we're going from strong growth to recession and what have you. But I want to talk also about the determinants of the long-run rate of unemployment. So abstracting from these cyclical changes, and this exists even when the economy is operating at what economists refer to as potential GDP. So, and potential GDP isn't meant to be the maximum level of GDP that is possible, but instead the level of GDP that's neither sort of growth being overheated or going into a recession. And there are two key components of the natural rate of unemployment that economists refer to. The first is frictional unemployment. And this is kind of, you can think of as good unemployment. We want people to be moving around from one job to another. And we know that companies come and go. So a lot of companies each year go out of business. And workers can't immediately find a new job. Let's say their company goes out of business because its product isn't in demand anymore. We wouldn't necessarily want a worker to take the absolute first job that they can find. We may want them, it makes sense for them to search for a while to potentially find a good match. So there's some benefit to a worker, let's say if their company goes out of business or if their plant closes, to spend a little time and try to find a good match. So having some people out there looking for jobs is a sign of, is not a bad thing, it's potentially a good thing. And the choice variables for an individual include their search intensity, how much time are they spending searching, and what economists refer to as their reservation wage. What is the, you can think of a person out looking in the labor market, and they may only be willing to accept a job if it has a wage above a certain level or annual earnings above a certain level. Okay, and those are things that they can choose, and these may be affected by government policy. So we're going to talk in a second about a program called unemployment insurance that the government uses to pay benefits to people when they're not working. If that program is really generous, then people may not look very hard, their search intensity may not be very high, and they may be very picky about their next job in terms of a high reservation wage. Okay, but this frictional unemployment is what we would expect in a dynamic economy with new companies starting all the time, existing companies closing all the time. There's fluctuation, the labor market is changing, and so we don't necessarily want frictional unemployment to be at zero. There's also, though, structural unemployment, and this is potentially more problematic than the frictional. So if you think of an industry in which, when an industry shrinks, if there are workers in that industry who have skills that don't transfer to other areas, that suggests a mismatch between the level of skills in the economy and the job opportunities that are available. And this is a more problematic form of the natural rate of unemployment. So these are the sort of two key components to it. Okay? But the fact that we have a 3.6% unemployment rate 30 years ago, people would have thought was like almost impossible. And so there have been factors, people have been trying to understand how can this be that we have such a low unemployment rate? What's contributed to this change in the natural rate of unemployment? When I was in grad school, I think people would have thought it was more around 5.5%. I'm not saying 3.6 is natural. Natural is probably somewhere in between these two levels. But one important factor is, I can't underline there, is the age distribution in the economy. So as a larger share of the workforce is in their 40s and 50s and early 60s, unemployment rates, as I talked about last time, are lower for this group, so we're going to see unemployment rates fall. The temporary help industry is a pretty easy way for workers to find, to get some experience to help transfer, to help build up skills that will be useful for a longer run position. It's now, a third reason is that it's now much easier to search for jobs than it was 30 years ago. And so a person who's out of work may be well positioned to find what is available sooner. And then finally is the gig economy, the existence of, basically now you have a lot of opportunities for people to work flexibly, part-time or even full-time, driving for Uber or Lyft, doing odd jobs for places like TaskRabbit and so forth. And so all of those may have contributed to a fall in the natural rate of unemployment. But this is really good news, the fact that we have an unemployment rate of 3.6% versus if you'd been sitting in this class 10 years ago, it would be almost 3 times that level, okay? You got a question right here, and so let's hope that I can do better on this one than I did on the last one.
Where do unpaid interns fit on the unemployment rate?
Unpaid interns would, I believe, be counted as employed. I'm pretty sure I mean, they're not a large share of the workforce of our 160 million people, but I think they would be counted as employed, especially if they're not looking for a job. If you're an unpaid intern, if you're not making any money and you're looking for a job, then there are these somewhat blurry categories, but my understanding is that if you're, let's say, unpaid 20 hours a week, that you would be counted as employed. Could be Gina and Hui and Noah, Kevin, not sure. Good questions, so yeah, it is. I think the number of unpaid interns is relatively small, but it's a good question. Okay, so now I want to talk about unemployment insurance. Oh, you had a question. I'm sorry. 2 rows back. 2 rows back.
Because all of these types of unemployments are pretty nuanced and pretty personal, like what stage is someone at in their unemployment?
Yeah.
How is the government getting information about what type of unemployment someone's currently experiencing?
So that's a great question. So there's a monthly current population survey that's conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. About 60,000 people they survey each month. And there's a set of questions that they ask. So they ask, are you employed? If not, are you looking for a job? And then they have several other more detailed questions. If you answer that you're unemployed and looking for a job, they have questions like, how long ago did you lose your job? And they have additional questions like, how long ago did you lose your job? Why did you lose your last job? Did you leave voluntarily, for example? So there are a number of additional questions beyond that.
So it's basically surveyed and then the data is generalized to the United States public.
Yeah, they try to survey a nationally representative set of the population, and it is it's inherently there's some error in the process for sure, but they try to get better and better at it over time.
Thank you.
Great question. Sure. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about unemployment insurance. So this is a program that economists and policymakers think a lot about. It's a program that basically it pays temporary benefits to people who lose their jobs. And so it's to assist them as they look for a new job, and it's to cushion the effects of job loss. I've reported to you a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, some data indicating that a very large share of the population does not have enough money in the bank if they get some unexpected expense of $400. Suppose that I got hit with some unexpected medical event that costs $400. A very large fraction of the population does not have the money in the bank to cushion the effects of that. Partly because of that, because people don't have a lot of savings, we have this program that helps people if they lose their job, to pay temporary benefits to those who lose their jobs. Okay? And if you look, was this 2 weeks ago, 210,000 workers in the US started receiving unemployment insurance benefits in the week from February 9th to February 15th. So this data is released every week by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They get information from every state unemployment agency about how many people started receiving benefits and how many are currently receiving benefits. So the number who are currently receiving benefits is much higher. About 1.7 million people were receiving unemployment insurance in that week. Okay? So these benefits, the way that, and that is much lower, the number receiving unemployment insurance is much lower than the total number unemployed. Last time I reported to you that the CPS survey estimates that 5.9 million people total are unemployed, and only about 30% of them are receiving unemployment insurance right now, okay? Partly because some of them wouldn't be eligible for unemployment insurance. Suppose I've been out of the workforce for 10 years and decide to enter back in and start looking for a job. I'm not going to be eligible for unemployment insurance because I didn't just lose my job, okay? You have to have been working to qualify for unemployment insurance. And there's a lot of research trying to think about how generous should we make this program. And I talked earlier when we were talking about welfare programs in the EITC about the trade-off between protection and distortion. It is very apparent here for this program. The way the program works is if you lose your job, you can collect, and there's slight variance on this because states differ a little bit in their benefits, but to a first-order approximation, it is true that if you get 50% of your recent wage up to a weekly maximum, so you get 50% of your past earnings up to a weekly maximum, and that weekly maximum varies a lot across states. So in Mississippi, $235 is the maximum amount you can receive each week. Whereas in Massachusetts, the maximum amount that you can receive each week is $795. Okay, California is between those two extremes, as is Texas. Florida is much closer to the Mississippi level, whereas Washington, the state of Washington, is much closer to Massachusetts. So basically in every state, unemployment insurance replaces 50% of your past wages up to a maximum. And let me just show you how this works. So essentially if you have earnings per week, and so if we're in, suppose we're in California with a maximum of $450 per week. This would be $900, and this would be $450. So if you earn $900 a week in California and you lose your job, you can collect unemployment insurance benefits that will give you $450 per week. If you're in Massachusetts, that could go higher, up to $795. Whereas if you're in Mississippi, that maximum would be much lower at $235. So this is California, this is Mississippi, okay, and Massachusetts. And there's a different maximum weekly benefit in each state. And the slope of this thing is 50%. So slope equals a half. I'm going to pause there for a second, see if you guys have questions on this. Got a question right here, so someone over here has the microphone cube. Do you guys have the cube over here, the microphone cube? Hello? Yeah. Great, thanks. Dude, what do you think, yeah?
I'm confused on how they decided, arguably, like New York and California, like living there is a lot higher than in like Washington State or Massachusetts. Yeah.
Why it differs so much across the states?
Well, it makes sense that it differs, but I'm confused why California and New York are only like $450, while like Washington State is at like
$790.
Because I would think that it's more expensive to live in California or New York.
Right. It's somewhat surprising, but it's partly because, so that's a great question. Why is it just $450 in California versus $790 maximum in Washington? And it's a decision by state policymakers in California. Like this is a decision, so it's a trade-off. Partly it makes the program less expensive to have a lower weekly maximum. As you're going to see in a second, the taxes used to finance this are low in California relative to in Washington, and it's a decision made by the state. So this is a way in which California doesn't look maybe as generous as other states, but partly, if you think about it, it only matters for the person who's, so this person who's earning $900 a week, that's $47K a year. So if you're under $47K a year, it doesn't matter if you're in California or Washington, you lose your job. Whereas this person in, let's say Washington is at $790, so this is basically going to be like $1,600, right, which is about $83K a year. So if you're making $83K a year and you lose your job, you'd much prefer to be in Washington State than in California, right? But it's, I mean, I don't, why it's surprising to me, actually, that California and Texas are relatively close. And on this metric, actually, Texas looks a little more generous than California. And the state of Washington is much more generous than both of them. So it's a good, I don't have a good answer for it beyond this is what policymakers here in the state decided. And I think it's a decision they made to make the benefits less generous and the taxes lower, as you'll see in a second. So does that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's surprising, though. I agree with you, it's surprising. So this number right here, why replace 50%? Why not 40% or 60%? So there are a lot of economists who have done research to try to think about what is the optimal level of generosity for this program. Okay, and you're trading off two things. If you make it 100%, for example, let's say we doubled it, then workers are not going to be very hungry to find a new job. They may be happy to just stay out of work for 26 weeks. Okay? And the idea of unemployment insurance is to help people temporarily while they search for a new job. Okay, soon after I graduated in 1992 from MIT, I had a friend who graduated with me who was working. He got laid off from his job. He'd been working there for a couple of years, and he decided that he was going to collect his unemployment insurance and learn how to race motorcycles, never having ridden a motorcycle before. And so spent those 26 weeks, I'm going to tell you in a second that the maximum duration is 26 weeks, training, learning how to race motorcycles. That is not what unemployment insurance was designed for, to help people on their hobbies. It is to give people some help until they can find a new job. But why 50%? If you made it more than 50, if you made it 100%, people wouldn't be very hungry. They'd be content to stay on unemployment insurance as long as possible. If you made it much less than 50%, then people would endure a lot of hardship, because if you're only giving them 20%, let's say, of their earnings, that wouldn't be enough to help them pay their rent and their utility bills and gas to drive to possible new jobs and so forth. But why 50% is the sweet spot, is the Goldilocks level, is something that a lot of people have done research on. And some economists think it should be 65 or 70. Okay, but there's no right level of this. It's a trade-off. You make it more than 50%, you're going to make people less hungry to find a new job, but you'll also help people smooth their consumption more across states of the world. And so there's no right level. And that exact same question exists for the duration of unemployment benefits. So how long should the duration be? Should it be 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, or what? And so it is, right now, it is in virtually every state, it is 26 weeks. So basically it gives you help for 6 months. And if you're unable to find a job in those 6 months, then then your unemployment insurance benefits get exhausted. So one way to show this graphically, as you can think of, weeks UI. Basically, so for the person, so suppose a person was getting $350 or whatever it is, call it some level B. It would be at B per week for 26 weeks, and then after that, 0. Okay? And so the US is different than many of other industrialized countries. This 26 weeks is pretty stingy relative to other countries. A lot of other countries give a year or 2 years maximum duration of unemployment insurance. And there's been a lot of research by economists on the question of what is the right replacement rate? Is 50% the right level? What is the right maximum benefit? And what is the right number of weeks? And each of these, there's this trade-off between protection and distortion. And so this program isn't going to be important for, this program may not be important for someone who's earning like $300,000 a year. They may not even bother to go to the unemployment insurance office to collect benefits if they were to lose their job, okay? It's potentially going to matter most for people at lower earnings levels. So I'm going to pause there for a sec, see if you guys have a question. Yes? No? Okay. So as the generosity of unemployment insurance goes up, that is going to increase the natural rate of unemployment in the economy. Because if you change the replacement rate tomorrow from 50% to 80%, people would be in less of a rush to find a new job, okay? Similarly, if you let people stay on the program for 52 weeks instead of 26 weeks, more people would be unemployed, okay? And it's just a standard trade-off between these two things. Okay, additionally, there's variation. So I said that the main way in which states differ is with respect to this maximum benefit. And one thing I forgot to mention was that in 2009, in the depths of the Great Recession, pretty much every state extended their maximum number of weeks of benefits to 99 weeks, okay? So if you lost your job when the economy was in free fall, and unemployment went from 4% to 10% in a very short period of time, the government said, we recognize there aren't many jobs out there, so we're going to give you more time than usual, almost 2 years maximum level of benefits. Okay, and this was really expensive, as you'll see in a second. Okay. And so that concentrated only on the benefit side. I now want to talk about the tax side of unemployment insurance. So companies pay taxes into state unemployment insurance programs that are what's called experience rated. So if I'm a company that consistently lays a lot of workers off, and thus a lot of my old workers are getting unemployment insurance, I'm going to pay a higher tax. Higher taxes to firms that lay off more workers. Okay? And so this is trying to get firms to internalize the costs that they impose on the unemployment insurance system. So my first job for when I was in high school and the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, I used to work for a landscaping company. And the landscaping company I'm from the Boston area, so it would be difficult to mow lawns in January, February, and March if with snow on the ground. So typically they didn't employ people during those months. Okay. Now, if they had not paid taxes one thing that you could do if you were in an industry like landscaping or construction is every December say to your workers, look, I'm going to lay you off, and you can get 3 or 4 months of unemployment insurance benefits, go to Florida for the winter or something, and then come back in April when the snow has melted and you can start building houses again or mowing lawns again, okay, and so forth. But unemployment insurance isn't designed for that kind of thing. It doesn't want to subsidize companies to lay off workers so that they can take a vacation. And so part of the reason to experience rate this is to make it more expensive for the company. If you're laying off workers all the time, we're going to, whether it's the landscaping company or a company that's deciding that it doesn't need its workers, we're going to charge you higher taxes if you lay off more workers. So the way this works is there's a tax rate, tau, and this differs a lot across states. And you can think of some measure of layoffs per worker. And this tax rate, how this works, varies across states. But basically, there's a maximum tax rate and a minimum tax rate for each company. And so you can see, so I'm going to pause. I want you to look at this for a second and think about it. Number of layoffs per worker is on the horizontal axis. The tax rate that the company pays for unemployment insurance benefits, for the unemployment insurance program, is on the vertical axis. And what I've given you is 3 examples of states. Let's take Washington and California. In California, companies only pay unemployment insurance taxes on their first $7,000 in wages to the person. Okay? And so, whereas in the state of Washington, companies pay unemployment insurance taxes on their first $52,000 in wages for each worker. So there was a question earlier about why California was much stingier than Washington. A big part of the reason is that the state of California has decided we want to have low unemployment insurance taxes, a low tax base, whereas Washington is willing to have a much higher one. Okay? But it is important that this gives firms an incentive to use UI less. Okay? So if you lay off a lot of workers, then you're gonna have to pay a higher unemployment insurance tax for your existing workers in the future. Okay? And I just want to do one more slide before we take a little break, but let me just pause here to see if you have a question. So these three graphs are important, so I just want to make sure you understand this. And so you can see in California, all firms pay an unemployment insurance tax in California of at least 1.5% on that $7,000, whereas in Washington, if you don't lay off any workers, you'll pay no unemployment insurance taxes. Okay? It's very different, a lot of differences across states in how this works, but it's a hugely important program, and you can see somewhat the importance of this program here, of what happened during the Great Recession. So unemployment insurance runs deficits when the economy is in recession, and a surplus when the economy is strong. Here we've got 16 years of data from 2005 to 2020. And if you look, this is aggregating across all of the state unemployment insurance programs. In 2005, total unemployment insurance revenues from taxes was $42 billion in the US, okay? And total outlays, those represent largely benefits to people on unemployment insurance, were $33 billion. So the program was running a pretty big surplus back 15 years ago, okay? Ran a surplus again in 2006, 43 versus 32. Again in 2007, 41 versus 33. Okay, and then in 2008, things started to go, revenue started to go down somewhat, 39.4, whereas spending was going up, 43, because unemployment rates were starting to rise. Revenues fell a little more to 2009 as fewer people were working. And look, in that 1-year time period, the benefits paid out from this program tripled. So you went from $43 billion being paid in benefits to $120 billion in the course of a year. And so now in 2010, revenue started to rise, and this was partly because so many companies are laying off workers and they're all paying higher tax rates. You can see benefits went up to $156 billion. So that is a huge change. From 2007 to 2010, benefits quintupled from $33 billion to $156 billion, okay? So the program needs to run a surplus when the economy is doing well to save up for when the economy tanks. And so you can see today, look at 2019, so 2020 is projected data. In 2019, the unemployment insurance program is right now running a big surplus, $43 billion in revenue versus $27 billion in expenditures, saving up for a future recession so that the programs try to be self-sustaining. So the unemployment insurance taxes are designed by each state so that when the economy tanks, they've got enough money in reserve to pay out the benefits. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for a second. Let's take an 8-minute break, and we'll see you here back in a little bit. And if you have questions, feel free to come up, including especially over here. Okay, thanks. So I got the question at the break, why do we have a maximum tax rate? And so I just wanted to mention that it's a little tricky. Like each state has reached a different decision on how to finance their unemployment insurance programs. Some have a bigger tax base, others have bigger tax rates. But part of the rationale for having a maximum tax rate is that if you think about it, you're sort of kicking the company when they're down, in the sense that if a company gets hit with some adverse shock and has to lay off 30% of their workers, it's not obvious that you want to have their unemployment insurance tax go to like 50%, because then they may not be able to recover from that, and that may really. So it's a trade-off. If you put that maximum tax too high, you may put a lot of companies out of business, companies that would be profitable if you just gave them a little help while the economy recovers. So this is, the measure here is layoffs per worker. What exact measure is used is varies across states. So I didn't give you these numbers here. It could be that once you lay off more than 1% of your workers, you start to pay a higher tax. And if you lay off, let's say, above 10% of your workers, beyond that point, you don't pay an additional penalty. But these levels, just like the max and the min, they all vary across the states, and each state has taken a different approach. California, by the way, has historically been in deficit, partly because of this really low tax base that they have. But everyone in California, these taxes are paid by employers, so you won't see these, but your employer is paying them when you work for them, and so it is it's an important factor for companies. And one of the things that happens because of the way that unemployment insurance is, these taxes are experience rated, what that means is that after recessions, you're going to see that the taxes tend to rise. So you see here 2007, 2008, 2009, it takes time for the tax rates to go up because they actually average your layoffs over a 3 or 4 year period. So you can see it's not necessarily ideal to have these tax rates going up just as the economy is trying to recover from recession. So that's another sort of reason to have some cap on how much companies might have to pay. And just, as before, the UI tax, let's say we're in Massachusetts, the tax in Massachusetts for a particular company, and here's the worker's earnings. It would be at some level up to $15,000 and then zero beyond that point. Okay, so this might be in Massachusetts, if you're a typical firm, maybe you have a 2% unemployment insurance tax. So that would be about $300, not necessarily a huge amount, but if you've laid off a lot of workers, you can pay a tax as high as 14.4% in Massachusetts, which would be over $2,000 per worker, which would be a lot. Okay. And so you can see here that the tax rate tends to rise soon after recessions because of this experience rating in taxes. So this number right here is the average tax rate on total wages, and you can see it came up as close almost to 1% of total wages soon after the recession. Okay, that wraps up the unemployment part. I'm going to pivot to inflation, but I'll just pause here for a second, see if you guys have any questions on any of this. Okay, so unemployment is a macro indicator that macro economists pay a lot of attention to. Another one that economists pay a lot of attention to is inflation, and it is a measure of the increase in the level of prices. And there are many different measures of inflation that we're going to talk about today. And this will tend to vary across products from one period to the next. So the sign and magnitude of price changes will tend to vary over time. and across products. So here I just have taken 5 different products, and I'm comparing their prices in 1980 and 2015. And 2015. And so if you look over that 35-year time period, the price per pound for bananas on average almost doubled, whereas the price per pound of white bread almost tripled. Price for an unleaded gallon of gasoline about doubled. Frozen orange juice about doubled, a little more than doubled. And so you can see that in general, prices go up over time in the economy. And during that same period, from 1980 to 2015, per capita GDP in nominal terms more than quadrupled. So it went from $12,500 to $55,000 annually, but a lot of that reflects an increase in the level of prices, okay? So if we looked at the increase in real GDP per capita would be much, much smaller than that. Okay? And so what many economists and government agencies try to do is aggregate all of the price changes that are going on in the economy into one or a small number of measures. And so in doing this, they define a representative basket of goods and services in some base period, and then ask how much do price changes for this basket of goods from one period to the next, from 1980 to 2015, from December 2019 to January 2020. It depends on what periods you're considering, okay? And the products that account for a larger share of spending in a baseline period are going to matter more. So let's suppose that I take a very simple basket that just has 2 goods in it, 1 unit of frozen orange juice and 1 pound of bananas. Over the 35-year time period that we looked at before, the orange juice price went up by 125%, the banana price by 79%. So the price of the basket increases by something between those 2 levels, because those are the only 2 products in this basket, okay? This is not anything remotely close to what actual basket gets used for these. But if that was the basket, then the overall measure of the price increase would be 115%. That's the measure of the average price increase for that basket of goods, okay? In practice, the calculation of this overall price level is much, much, much more complicated, okay? As I'm going to talk about in a second, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are about 80,000 products that get considered from one month to the next while we're trying to look at how prices are changing in the economy, okay? And the most widely used measure by far of inflation in the US, and this is true in other countries too, is the measure called the Consumer Price Index. Okay? And you may remember from before that consumption accounts for about two-thirds of GDP. So this isn't considering prices for investment goods or for government spending. Okay? This is for consumption. And basically this is the most widely used measure of inflation. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the agency that calculates the Consumer Price Index. And they consider basically goods and services purchased by a typical family of 4. Okay? And it's not a perfect measure for a lot of reasons. First is substitution across products. Okay? If a price of a good increases, I can substitute away to a different product. Suppose that the price of apples doubled and the price of oranges stayed unchanged. Okay, you could say, oh, well, maybe the prices have gone up by 50% if those are the only 2 goods in the basket. But in practice, I can shift over to oranges, so that can cushion the effect of the price change. So substitution across products suggests that if we just take a measure that doesn't account for that, we're going to overstate inflation. Okay? So this is one big problem with it. And then 2A, you can call it, and 2B. One is improvements in existing products. So if I look from one period to the next and I see the price increase of a good, from one year to the next I see the price increase of a good, is that reflecting inflation or is it reflecting something about the quality of the product? Okay? Suppose that the Toyota Camry goes from $30,000 in year T to $31,000 in year T plus 1. Is that a 3% price increase, or is it instead a quality improvement? That's pretty hard, actually, to get at that. And it's especially difficult for things like medical care, education, financial services. If you look, for example, at Stanford tuition over the years, you will see that it outpaces inflation. And is the price rise each year, is that just inflation, or is it improvements in quality, or something different? Related to this is the introduction of new products. Okay? As new products are coming in and people are consuming them, how do we account for that in an inflation measure if we're going to use a fixed basket of goods? Okay? If we use like a basket of goods from 1980, 40 years later, things are totally different in terms of what consumers are buying. Okay? So this is inherent challenges for anything where you try to measure inflation. There's going to be these factors that make it somewhat more complicated. We've got a question back here. Let me see where okay, great. Thanks. I will yeah, oh, you've got like 5 laptops. Okay.
How is this measure different than looking at like the deflator and measuring the change in price levels?
So the GDP deflator, great question. So another measure of inflation that we're going to talk about is the GDP deflator that tries to look also at investment goods and government spending. So for example, take like Boeing. Boeing sells a lot of products to the U.S. Defense Department, airplanes, other things. If the price of that goes up, that's not going to affect the CPI, but it is going to affect the GDP deflator. Okay, so there are certain goods that would be included in the GDP deflator. So if you're trying to look at, let's say, adjust nominal GDP over time to do an apples-to-apples comparison, you'd want to use the GDP deflator rather than the CPI.
Could I say that the deflator tries to adjust for inflation, or no?
GDP deflator is like a measure of the price level in the economy. So it's basically gives you a sense of how much to deflate to adjust to adjust real GDP to a specific baseline year. So you can normalize and you can make the value of it 100, let's say in 2000, and then if it's 150 by 2020, then you need to basically divide the 2020 nominal GDP by 1.5 to account for that price increase. Does that answer? Yeah? Okay, great. Thanks for that. It's really difficult to measure quality for goods like medical care or education or financial services. So these are inherent challenges. It's pretty easy. I mean, maybe the quality of bananas has gotten better over time, but it's probably not, it's probably not a huge issue with comparing 1980 versus 2015. But for other things, it's a much bigger difference. And since the early 2000s, or basically BLS now tries to update the fixed basket more often, because if you didn't update it, then you would have this problem where the things that consumers were purchasing were not being picked up in the measure of inflation. So how does the Bureau of Labor Statistics do this? They take data from 7,000 households to try to get what is the representative basket and price changes at 23,000 retail establishments. And they select a basket for a typical household, and there are 8 major groups of expenditures with weights. Okay? So housing is by far the biggest one. 42% of food and beverages is about 15%, transportation about 16%, and there are subcategories, so there's more than 200 expenditure categories that are included, and the total number of products is about 80,000, and they go to about 100 different areas in the US. Okay? There are a lot of people who are physically doing this, who are physically going out and collecting prices at retail establishments across different areas. And so you can, if we telescope in on food as one category, so we'll see food here is 13.8% of, so this is the relative importance of the category. And this is taken from the most recent, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month updates the consumer price index. So here I'm telescoping in on one category, food. This is from their December 2019 report. Food's 13.8%, which conflicts with this here, but that included beverages too. So beverages are another 1%. Here I'm only looking at food. So food, about 60% of food purchase is for at home, and about 40% is away from home. So like when people go out to eat. So the average person spends about 6.2% of their income going out to eat, and 7.6% on food that is consumed at home. And then you can look in any one of these. So this is like a major category. This is one of the 8 major categories. This is one of the subcategories, and this is these are even more narrow products. So take, like, for example, fruits and vegetables. In this same report, you can see that, so fruits and vegetables are about 1.3%. So the average household spends about 1.3% of their income on fruits and vegetables. That's partly apples, that's partly bananas, it's partly lettuce and tomatoes. Okay, you can see that each of these is contributing. So they're basically trying to look, and some people don't eat any bananas, and other people don't eat any apples. They're trying to average across households. And so then they're going to look at how the price of apples changes from one year to the next, how the price of bananas changes from one year to the next, to see what's happening to price changes. Okay, does this make sense? So they really do make this pretty granular, so that they are accurate, so that they're trying to do, to see how prices are changing over time. Okay, and here, this is basically data taken from the last almost 60 years, from 1960 to 2018. Here's the annual inflation rate in the US. Okay, and inflation was, as I've mentioned a bit earlier, very high back in around 1980. It went over 13%. Lately, it's been pretty much around 2.5%. The last 20 years or so, it's pretty much been around 2.5% over that time period. And for reasons that we're going to talk about next time and early next week, having stable inflation is considered to be a good thing, because it gives households and individuals some confidence about how things are going to change from one period to the next. You got a question? Let me get the microphone ball. Thank you. Oh, shoot. Okay, great. Catch.
About the CPI, I'm just wondering, does it give weight to some specific goods opposed to others, like some basic living supplies?
Does it give weight to some products, not others?
Yeah, because I feel like some goods could be more expensive than others, so the changes in those goods' price could kind of have a greater impact on the CPI than others.
Yeah, they basically try to get what is the share of each product in each person's in the average person's spending. And so, for example, I believe what this means here is that, like, you can see fresh fruits, the average household spends about 0.5% of their income on fruits and about 0.5% of their income on vegetables. So they try to calculate these percentages. And so to the extent that a product is really expensive, but maybe it doesn't get used very much, so it might not matter that much in the calculation. So this is meant to be consumption for the average household. Does that answer?
Yes.
Kind of? Okay, great. Thanks. Any other questions? Oh, good. Okay. And so this is a really important, and for reasons that you're going to see in a second, measuring inflation accurately from one year to the next is really important so that people have a sense of how they're doing. If my earnings are going up 4% a year and inflation's only going up 2% a year, then my purchasing power is going up over time. Okay? And so this is inflation over a long time period. You can see that there have been a couple of times when inflation has hit zero for the year, or even gone slightly below zero. The second of these, right here in 2015, when inflation went really low, that was driven by the drop in gas prices, in energy prices. So if you look, this is a 12-month percent change in the CPI relative to 12 months earlier. What you can see is that this one right here is the CPI excluding food and energy, which are more volatile. Okay, but what you can see is that this is in October of 2014. Okay, the two inflation measures were telling about the same story, and then the measure that includes food and energy fell from almost 2% down to less than 0, okay, over a very short time period. And this was driven by falling energy prices. So if you had been going to fill up gasoline each week, the price at the pump fell by a lot over this time period. So overall inflation in the U.S. actually declined, like the overall price level actually declined from this. This is comparing January 2014 versus January 2015. Okay, prices actually fell over this time period. And this is important because in general, the metric that gets more widely used is the one that excludes food and energy, because food and energy are very volatile. So food and energy prices change a lot from one period to the next. And so you can see this with the most recent report right here. You can see this is the measure that we're at about 2.3% inflation in January 20. This is versus January 2019. You can see that's much more stable than, let's say, the one that includes all items, both food and energy, which seems to move around somewhat more. So it's generally much less volatile when food and energy prices are excluded from the calculation. Pause there for a second. See if you guys are good. Okay, great. So the consumer price index is just one measure of how prices are changing in the economy. It's meant to be an average consumer. There are other measures that look, for example, at certain categories of consumers. So for example, if you were to calculate a CPI for elderly individuals, elderly being defined as people 65 and up in the US, you wanted to see what's happening to the cost of living for them, what's happening to their prices. Medical care is going to matter a lot more for people in their 60s and 70s than it matters for people in their 20s and 30s. So the weight of medical care in the consumer price index for elderly individuals is going to, for medical care, is going to be higher for elderly individuals than it will be for young adults. Okay? So that's just a certain category of consumers. That's one kind of focus. Another kind of focus is certain geographic areas. So there are 3 places in the US, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, where they do a consumer price index that is specific to that city. Because prices may be going up more in, let's say, Los Angeles than they're going up in Chicago. Okay, and they also do it monthly for each of the 4 census regions. And every other month, they do it for Boston, Houston, San Francisco, and 8 other cities. Okay? There's also something called, in contrast to the consumer price index, the producer price index, that tries to look at what is happening to the prices that companies are paying for their inputs. Okay? And so it's analogous to the CPI. Another measure is the employment cost index. How much is it costing firms to hire workers? And it's a measure of wage and benefit inflation in the labor market. And then finally, the one that was referred to a little bit earlier, the GDP deflator. This includes all components of GDP, in contrast to the CPI, which only covers consumption. Okay? And so at some level, so I showed you the data for the US over a long time period, and you see that there were some high episodes in the mid-1970s and the early 1980s, but in general, for quite some time, it's been pretty stable at about 2% per year. Prices have been going up an average of 2% per year in the US. Okay? It's pretty similar to that for other countries. So this is a graph taken from OpenStax here, and here it compares inflation rates in the US with Japan, Germany, and the UK. And you can see that for the most part, they followed a pretty similar trajectory. The US and the UK both had these big rises in the mid-70s, both had pretty big rises in the early 80s, even bigger in the UK than the US. And for the most part, all of these countries have been pretty low, down around 2% over this time period. It's been lowest actually in Japan during this time period. Prices have been going down there somewhat. So inflation in industrialized countries has been pretty stable for a long time. But that has not been the case in all countries. So if you look at some countries in Latin America, the experience has been very different. So there was what's called hyperinflation in Argentina and Brazil in the early 1990s, where the annual inflation rate exceeded 2,000%, and much higher than that even recently in Venezuela. Okay? So what happened in Venezuela, it's pretty remarkable. This is taken from a Wall Street Journal article from 2 years ago. How fast are prices skyrocketing in Venezuela? Okay? So the Venezuelan economy has not been doing well, and both the level of GDP, real GDP, has been falling, and also inflation has really taken off. So $1 US now fetches around 236,000 bolivars on the street, around 80 times what it bought at the start of the year. 5 years ago, that could buy a small apartment. Now it barely covers an appetizer at lunch. So the value of their currency has shrunk quite a lot. So this was taken from February 2018. Venezuela has become the 57th recorded case of hyperinflation. So it is really bad. I mean, basically, you don't want to hold on to money there because every minute the value of any money that you hold in Venezuela is eroding because prices are going up. Okay? And so this is an article from just a few months ago. And so what you see, inflation has fallen from a peak 12-month rate of 2.6 million% in January. Okay, so compare that with where it was inflation will hit 13,000. So this looked really bad 2 years ago when it was at 13,000%. It hit 2.6 million% in January, and they were celebrating that it had fallen down to just 135,000%. So this is a major challenge for Venezuela's economy, and it has been, but they're getting it somewhat under control now. But basically, if you think about, just imagine if, let's say you could buy an apartment, buy a condo for $400,000 today, and then a few years later, suddenly you could only buy breakfast with that. That's kind of what's happened to their currency over a very short time period. So it's an example, and we're going to talk a lot about the causes of inflation, like why did this happen? Why can we have such high inflation? But it's a pretty terrible thing that's been going on there. So consequences of inflation as opposed to causes, we're going to talk later about the causes. Okay, one is that it's difficult to extract the signal from the noise in price changes. If we look out at, so we kind of expect prices to go up a couple of percent a year. Some prices might go up 5%, others might go up 1%. Okay, there's going to be some variation. Sometimes a price increase is reflecting an improvement in the quality of that product. But if inflation is bouncing around a lot from one year to the next, it makes it difficult for companies to make decisions about how to change their prices, and whether it makes it hard for consumers to figure out, are these price changes reflecting maybe improvements in the quality of the product, or are they just reflecting inflation? Another consequence of inflation is uncertainty. So banks may become reluctant to lend if they expect high inflation going forward. So my wife and I have a fixed rate mortgage for our house, a certain interest rate, and part of the reason that the bank was willing to lend to us at a 3.375% fixed rate is their expectation that inflation is going to remain subdued at, let's say, 1.5% or 2%. So if you have inflation, that creates uncertainty about what is $100 in a year or 5 years or 10 years going to be worth. Redistribution is another big effect of inflation. So borrowers, if you have borrowed a bunch of money and then suddenly inflation starts to go up, that actually erodes the real value of your debt, and that can lead to a benefit. But it also may discourage lending if banks think there's going to be a lot of inflation. Inflation interacts with the tax code. So suppose that I bought IBM stock in 1990 for $100, and then I sold it in 2010 for $180. In real terms, the value of that hasn't really gone up, okay? Because if the CPI, suppose that the CPI is increased by 80% over that same time period, but I would still be taxed on that $80 gain, okay? And that kind of thing is going to be even more problematic if inflation is really high, okay? If inflation's low, that will be less of a problem. The minimum wage, so the minimum wage was set at $7.25 in 2009, and it has not, this is the federal minimum wage. Okay, and that has not been adjusted in the last 10 years. Okay, so the real value of that minimum wage has fallen over time, so that's a consequence of inflation. And the same is true if I have a fixed pension. Suppose that a company is paying a worker $1,000 a month as a pension for their service to the firm. That's going to erode in value as inflation goes up. So why do we want to have any inflation at all? Why don't we want to just have then price stability? One reason that people think inflation is a good thing is it may make adjusting wages easier. So as I mentioned earlier, companies don't like to reduce workers' wages. Okay, let's say that you were earning $40,000 in 2020, and your company, and suppose they might want to lower your wages, but for various reasons they may prefer not to do that for the reasons that I talked about earlier. But it makes it easier for a firm to adjust real wages down. So if we have inflation of 3%, I can give all of my workers a 2% raise, so that they may be happy to get some raise, but it's like a real wage cut of 1%. So this is one possible benefit of having some inflation. It's not like people think that 0% inflation is ideal. In general, I would say economists are of the view that 2% inflation is better than 0% inflation for this sort of reason. And you can think about what happened to, if you look at the value of the minimum wage over time, so this is basically looking at things in 2013 dollars. If you look back, let's say in 1973, I'm sorry, this is 2012 dollars. The value of the minimum wage back then, the nominal value was much lower than it is today, so like $2 or $3 per hour. But in real terms, in inflation-adjusted terms, it was higher than it was by 2013. Okay, so inflation erodes the value of the minimum wage. And so partly because of inflation, you see a lot of indexing in the economy. So many wage contracts that unions negotiate have cost of living adjustments in them. So suppose a teachers union, like K through 12 teachers often are part of a union, and often the contracts that they negotiate have basically provisions that automatically update wages from one year to the next by the inflation rate. Similarly, Social Security benefits, we've talked a little bit about Social Security, those are scaled up by inflation each year. So every February, the government puts out a report about how much Social Security benefits. So for those of you, maybe some of you have grandparents or parents or uncles, aunts, what have you, who are receiving Social Security, each year their benefits go up by the CPI growth. Okay? And another place where indexing happens is with all these thresholds. So we've talked earlier about this is the progressive income tax schedule in the US. So you pay 10% on your first, let's say, $10,000 in income. You pay a much higher rate if you're earning over $200,000 a year. These thresholds, every year, the Internal Revenue Service adjusts these up to account for inflation, because if they didn't do that, there would be something called bracket creep, where my wage might go up from one year to the next, but it may only be going up with inflation, and I would be paying a higher and higher tax every year. Okay? And similar to this, a lot of people have what are called adjustable rate mortgages that fluctuate as a function of inflation, and it protects the lender if inflation unexpectedly increases. If I'm a lender and I give someone $500,000 and ask them for $600,000 back in 5 or 10 years, but inflation doubles the price level, that's worth a lot less. So this adjustable rate mortgages make lenders more willing to make those to borrow those amounts. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of background on this article, which I think is really interesting. I'm sorry that we didn't upload it sooner. On something called the Billion Prices Project, which originated at MIT. And basically, these two authors, I think it's Cavallo and Rigobon, were paying attention to the economy in Argentina. Okay, so they were looking at Argentina, and they were skeptical of the data that the government was putting out on the inflation rate. Okay, and so the government produces data. So in the US, I've talked about the consumer price index and the GDP deflator and so forth. Other countries have inflation measures too. And they were skeptical back in 2008 of the official data from the government that was suggesting inflation was only 8%. Okay, and so why would the government have an incentive to underreport inflation? I forget where the microphone, can you pass me the microphone cube? I'm just going to randomly throw it to someone. But why would the government want to have an incentive to underreport inflation rates?
To decrease consumer and business uncertainty.
Partly that. Okay, another reason? Okay, can you, okay, great.
In the United States, at least, it would decrease the amount that the government has to pay out in terms of Social Security benefits that are indexed for COLA.
Good, like that too. That's a good one. Got another one? We got another one back here. Thanks. You think? Oh, shoot, sorry. Terrible. My worst throw of the year. Okay. Sorry. There you go.
Well, if you think about like South America versus like more stable currencies, like to keep the exchange rate higher, at like or like more or closer to what the U.S. dollar is.
Yep, that's a good one. Another one is that if I tell, so this is the number that Rigobon and Cavallo came up with. Another reason is that if you tell people that inflation is 8%, okay, so suppose inflation is really 25%, and I'm going to tell you in a second why that data is more accurate. Suppose people's wages are going up 15 or 20% a year, and you tell them inflation is 8%, then they think, okay, well, my purchasing power is going up. I'm better off, even though I may not feel like it. And so part of the reason they had this incentive to understate, in addition to the 3 reasons that were just mentioned, was that it was a way to perhaps fool people into to try to say, hey, look, your wages are going up 12% a year. If people knew that the prices were actually going up 25%, they would know they were getting poorer. But if the government was saying to them, prices are only going up 8%, then they would think they were doing better over time. So they got skeptical of the inflation data, and they came up with an algorithm to scrape price data from lots of different retail establishments throughout Argentina to automate this process. So the article goes through the political stuff that happened in Argentina, and why basically here was the government reports of what was happening to inflation. And this misreporting stopped in July 2015. But before that, so they got this much more accurate measure of inflation doing this scraping. And then they applied this, as they'll talk about in the article, to the US as well to see how well the US works. And they argue that this is not necessarily a substitute for the inflation measures that the US calculates, but a useful way to gauge how reliable. And it's very easy because they call it the Billion Prices Project, and they had scraped more than 1 billion prices in their first 2 years of using this. So they're doing this now in the US, in Argentina, and they started a little company now to do this, that financial firms want to get this data from them, and they've figured out how to scrape it all. So it's a good example of sort of this big data that is improving the way that we collect statistics and do empirical research in economics. Okay, so yeah, please have a look. Only at the first 17 and a half pages of that article. Okay, so now I want to talk for the last 7 or so minutes about international trade. So international trade is an area that has been in the news a lot lately. And we're going to talk about capital flows as well. And when you talk about international trade, it's good to start with the U.S. current account balance, which includes both the trade balance, which is the difference between exports and imports, but it also includes primary and secondary income, which I'm going to talk about somewhat more now. So there are 4 primary components to the current account balance. One is goods, another is services, a third is, and so here are some examples, like food for goods, travel for services, and financial services. Primary income is mostly investment income. So if I buy shares, let's say in a German company, and it pays dividends to me, that's income that I get from Germany. Secondary income, this is foreign aid that we send, or remittances. So if someone comes to the U.S., works in the U.S., and sends some of that money back home, that's showing up in the secondary income. Okay, and the primary income is the trickiest of these, and I'll talk about that a little bit early next time. So here you can see, I'm not expecting anyone to memorize, here are the 4 components of the U.S. current account deficit. So you can see that for goods in the U.S., we run a massive trade deficit. We exported about $1.7 trillion, so all of these are in billions. We exported about $1.7 trillion and imported about $2.6 trillion in goods. And one thing to notice here is that trade in goods is much bigger than trade in services, even though services are a much larger share of GDP than goods. And that's partly because for a lot of services, it would be hard to trade them. Think of the health care that you receive at your local hospital, or the haircut that you get when you go to the barber or hair salon or what have you. Those things are harder to trade. But you can see for services, the U.S. actually runs a pretty big surplus of $260 billion. Primary income, and the trade deficit is the combination of those two things is $628 billion. It's basically just this 888 minus 260. Okay, but then these other 2 categories, primary and secondary income, what are they? Primary income, so U.S. investors get a lot of income. This is trying to look at flows of money across borders. So the U.S. received about $1.1 trillion in income from their assets that they own abroad, and about $800 billion in assets, in income from assets foreigners received on their U.S. assets. The U.S. sends a lot more money overseas than is sent to the U.S. from overseas. So foreign aid that the U.S. gives shows up in this $267 billion number here, and also remittances. So a lot of people who work in the U.S. who are from abroad send a lot of money home. And the total current account deficit is about $500 billion. Okay. And here you can see this graphically. This is just taken from the most recent data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And you can see here that on the services and primary income fronts, we are running surpluses, whereas on the goods and secondary income fronts, those are pulling down, basically leading us to have a current account deficit. Okay, and if you look at this over a long time period, the current account and merchandise trade balance as a percent of GDP, you can see that in general, we have tended to run trade and current account deficits. So the U.S. buys much more stuff from the rest of the world than the rest of the world buys from us. Okay? you can see this here with these numbers, right? This trade deficit being very high at $628 billion, okay? And how do we, so if we're buying so much more from the rest of the world than they are buying from us, what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that foreigners use those additional dollars that we send overseas to buy US assets. So foreigners buy a lot more. We're basically borrowing from the rest of the world to finance our current account deficit. And I encourage you to look at the parable, the two-person parable in OpenStax of Robinson Crusoe on Friday when you're looking over this material. But Americans owe other countries far more than they owe us, and it's getting serious. So because we've run these persistent trade deficits, we have year after year after year after year tended to borrow from the rest of the world. Okay, so an unprecedented US borrowing from other countries compared with what they borrow from the US is fast approaching danger level, US Treasury officials warn. So this was in March of 2017. And they said 8.4 trillion was very problematic, and it was a deficit worth about 45% of America's GDP. If you see, this is how the US net international investment position has changed since then. That data was released, that study was released right about there when we were at around 8 trillion. You can see that it's gotten increased by 3 trillion over the last few years. So we've borrowed an additional $3 trillion from the rest of the world. Where does a lot of that borrowing happen? A lot of it happens, the government in the US runs a big deficit, budget deficit, and a lot of that is being lent by people in other countries, China, Japan, the Middle East, and so forth. So our liabilities are growing more rapidly than our assets over this time period. And let me just see, and I think that's a natural place to stop, so why don't I stop there? So let me know if you have any questions. Sorry about office hours today, but email me if you want to meet another time other than that time, and hope you have a good couple days. See you Thursday.